Today's daf we're going to be learning is Masechet Avodah Zarah daf Kaf Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Schwartz in honor of her daughter Rina. With love to my incredible daughter who started me on my daf journey with Hadran. I'm continuously in awe of her with gratitude for who she is and what she contributes to the world. We're going to get started. Two short announcements. So I mentioned Din and Daf, which went up yesterday, and it's about really like democracy and minority rights in Israel, and in the light of Lo Techanem, and basically different approaches to, the issue once we had a country and the non-Jews or minorities, how do we relate to it, and how does this kind of affected the thought of different people, particularly when the state was established. Anyway, as a very interesting topic, very relevant and contemporary. The other topic, which is also super interesting, that went up yesterday, is Gefet, is on the topic of Lifnei Iver, and to what extent does Lifnei Iver apply? Is it only to Torah law? Is it also to rabbinic law? Particularly the issue of the kutim and malachim chol hamoed. How do we treat malachim chol hamoed? Debate about how serious. Also, very interesting and relevant topic. So two really interesting shiurim that went up. Okay. Again, you can find all this podcast called Beyond the Daf. You can find them all on our website. You can find them on YouTube. So whatever, choose your way of listening. Just to kind of put it out there, I don't have all the details yet, but we're preparing the bookmarks on Seder Kodshim, which we're going to start Bezrat Hashem in mid-September. So there'll be sponsorship opportunities. If anyone's interested, you can get in touch with us about sponsoring a bookmark in memory of someone, in honor of someone, like we've done in the past. And then at some point we'll open registration and people can register to receive your bookmarks. We'll mail them out like usual. Something to be looking forward to starting a new Seder. Okay, we're going to get started with the beginning of our daf. So there's a study guide today, which will definitely help organize the daf. It's not such a complicated daf, but it's always just helpful putting things into boxes and into organized manners to kind of understand the flow. We started with, at the beginning of our chapter, second chapter, we started with this idea that you can't put your animal in an inn. When you get to an inn, don't put your animal alone with a Gentile. There's concern that the Gentile might engage in relations. And again, that would be an issue, as I mentioned before, of lifnei iver lo titei michshol. You're putting a stumbling block by causing the Gentile to sin. However, it says in a different source that you can buy animals from Gentiles to bring as a sacrifice. Now, it's very clear that sacrifices can't be brought from animals that engage in bestiality. So if they're suspect, then how can we bring sacrifices? For this, we're going to have three answers, as I mentioned yesterday. We have one yesterday, which is we distinguished your own animal, the Gentile's own animal, again, the pagan's animal, versus the Jew's animal. A pagan who's suspect of engaging in bestiality, well, if it's their own animal, they're not going to do it with their own animal because it weakens the animal or cause the animal to be sterile if it's female. But someone else's animal, they don't care about. So they'll do that. And that's why we can't put our animals in an inn with pagan, because the pagan may engage in bestiality, and that would be our fault for basically making them stumble. And their sin is on us. That's first answer. Now we're going to go to answer number two. Each answer we're going to kind of deal with we'll see. So Ravina Amar, like we're not going to just leave them simply, we're going to question them. Ravina Amar lo kasha halachatchila hadiavad. He points out a difference between them. He says one is don't put your animal lichatchila ab initio with a pagan, because you never know what might happen. You'll be responsible then for causing them to sin. However, if the animal was already b'diavad, post facto, it was already alone with the Gentile. Like, for example, the Gentiles selling us an animal of the pagan idol worshiper is selling their animal. So that already they've been alone with the animal. There's no reason to be concerned that necessarily something happened. So ab initio, we don't create a situation where we're perhaps causing this pagan to sin. On the other hand, if the pagan was alone with the animal, we don't have to be concerned that anything happened. Now, it's not the most convincing answer, okay? Because if they're suspect, they're suspect. If they're not, they're not, right? It's a little bit weak. But Ravina is going to try to prove this from a contradiction between another line in our Mishna and a different Tanaitic source happens to be a Mishna in Ketubot on Daf Kaf Vav Amud Bet. Uminatem Radeshani Ben Lechatchila Leben Diavad. How do we know that we can make the same distinction in another place, that don't create a situation like this, but if it was already created, there's no reason to be concerned? Ditnan, it says in the Mishnah, our Mishnah, Lo tidyached isha imehem mipnei shechashudim ala arayot. So a woman can't be secluded alone with a Gentile because we're concerned that they're going to engage in relations with her. Urimenu, but it says in a different this Mishnah in Ketubot, Haisha shenichbesha bidei odei kochavim. Okay, this is a bit of a difficult sugya, especially in light of post-October 7th or October 7th. There's a woman who's captured, okay, taken captive by Gentiles, okay, again, pagan worshippers. Al yedei mamon, depends why she was taken captive. Now, the assumption here is she was taken captive for a reason. Either she owed, or really likely her husband owed money, or maybe she did, but they're going to try to get it from the husband, so they kind of kidnap her to get the money. Or she was al yedei nefashot. Okay, and we're going to distinguish between the cases. Nefashot means, you might think they want to kill her. No, it's not that. It's that she was taken because they wanted to kill her. Okay, meaning they thought she was obligated death to be killed. Okay, whether she had done something, we don't know why, but they want to kill her, and that's why they captured her. So, she was, like Rashi says, nitchayva hariga. She was like, they ruled that they were going to kill her. Now, again, that could sentence. That's the word I couldn't think of. Thank you. She was sentenced to death. Sentenced to death could mean, a real sentencing. It could mean it was a fake sentencing. Either which way, there's going to be a distinction here. Now, before we even get to the details of this, we have to remember some background. For those who learn Nashim, this might be familiar. For those who haven't learned this or not know this, might not be familiar, but this is complicated sugya about what happens. So let's take a regular woman who's married to a regular Yisrael, okay, non-Kohen. If she's married to this person and she engages in relations willingly with a different man while she's a married woman, she's an eshet ish, right? That's adultery. The rabbis basically said she's forbidden to her original husband, and she's forbidden to the one that she slept with now. Okay, that's like a penalty to penalize her and to make it disincentive to engage in adultery. She becomes forbidden to both. If she's married to a Kohen and she was raped even, okay, very difficult sugya. If she's raped, okay, or engaged in relations unwillingly, basically raped, then she's even forbidden to her husband. Okay, now when it's a Yisrael, non-Kohen, it's only if it was willing. If it's a Kohen, it's even if it wasn't done willingly, she's actually not allowed to go back to her husband, the Kohen. Okay, which is very complicated sugya. Just difficult to accept and complicated to implement. So now we have to just accept that's the situation, and that's because Kohanim have this higher standard, and therefore she can't. Now the question is, what are sugyas talking about? Are they talking about her going back to her husband, the Israel, and is there concern that she actually engaged in relations willingly with her captor? Which is hard to imagine. Some commentaries go that route. Seems more likely, and we'll go with the route that the sugya is talking about a woman who was raped, and even though it doesn't mention the word Kohen here, we assume we're talking about going back to her husband, the Kohen. So again, there's two ways to read the sugya. We'll read it through the rape because it seems hard to discuss a sugya that a woman was taken captive and then willingly engaged in relations with him. So we'll go with that interpretation. So like I said, the commentary is split into two, whether it's willing and Yisrael or whether it's rape and with a Kohen husband. So it says here in the Mishnah, okay, she was captured by pagans. If it was that she owed money to them, muteret, or her husband owed money, muteret lebala. When she gets out of there, we can let her go back to her husband. We don't assume she engaged in relations. This is already the contradiction. Okay, we'll continue on in the Mishnah for another minute, but already we have the contradiction, so let's put it out there. Sounds like the Ovdei Kochavim, the pagans, are not suspect that they engage in relations because we allow her to go back to her husband, as opposed to our Mishnah, which said, don't let this woman be secluded alone with a pagan because they'll likely engage in relations with her. So that's already the contradiction. But the next line in this Mishnah, which we'll return to later, is Al Yedei Nefashot Asura Lebala. If she was taken because she was going to be convicted for murder, then, and she gets out, she's forbidden to her husband when she gets back. Then there's concern. Okay, we don't know exactly why there's concern. If you go with the sugya that she was it was willingly and it was back to Yisrael, some people think that if she was going to be convicted to death, maybe she willingly engaged in relations with him to kind of get herself out, like to buy her freedom. But then you could say it's pikuach nefesh, hard to say. Anyway, there's a lot to be said about this, but we're going to go on. So now the main point being, if she was taken for money, she can go back to her husband. It means they're not suspect of arayot. So what do they answer? Why did we bring this? You probably forgot because we got sidetracked. We wanted to prove, Ravina wanted to prove how he gets this distinction, our Mishna versus the other text about that you can buy animals for sacrifices from Gentiles. L'chatchila b'diavad. L'chatchila, don't put your animal. B'diavad, if it was already there, though, you don't have to worry that anything happened. So this would be a perfect answer. Elalav shmamina, it must be shane lam ben l'chatchila l'diavad. Ideally, don't have a woman be secluded with a Gentile. Maybe something will happen. But if it already happened, you don't have to worry and assume, and then, all sorts of halachic ramifications. Like, could she go back to her husband? You don't have to assume that she engaged in relations with him. So the Gemara is going to reject this proof and say, that's not a good answer to that contradiction, which doesn't necessarily mean they reject Ravina's answer entirely, but they're rejecting his proof and they're rejecting his use of the answer that he's saying, oh, well, I can prove my answer because that's how we can resolve the Ketubot contradiction with our sugya. No. Okay, that part we reject. Unclear whether they reject completely Ravina or not. So they're going to say, Mimai. Maybe also b'diavad, you have to worry, meaning even b'diavad, you have to be concerned that she engaged in relations with the Gentile, okay, with the he, right? That Oved Kochavim, that pagan, the idol worshiper who took her captive, did engage in relations with her. However, there's something unique about the case of being taken captive for money. Why money? Because in the end, they want to get the money back from the husband. And they're going to be concerned that if they rape the woman, then the husband won't want to pay them the money. In other words, why this is exactly a good question. Maybe if they rape her, he won't be able to have her back as his wife, and maybe then, but that's hard to imagine. He won't try to release her anyway. But in other words, they feel like there's money on the line here, and they're only going to get their money if they kind of keep certain rules, okay, and don't cross a line that they shouldn't be crossing. So because of that, again, you have to think about why exactly. What, the husband's not going to release her, try to get her out anyway. But anyway, they're worried they're going to lose their money. Maybe they're worried that he's going to do anything it takes to get her out of there and not pay them the money, though. That's also okay. So that's a unique situation. And they further prove it by the line that they totally ignored, which is Teidad Katani Seifal, Yidena Fashara Surala Bala. And in fact, it even says in that same Mishnah, there are cases where we're concerned. And it must be, therefore, that only its unique mammon issue, if she's taken for money, that's the case we assume that it's different from the standard. But the standard is that we assume that they will rape her. And then they basically say that can't then be b'diavad l'chatchila. It's not true. And in fact, they're so strong in what they're saying here that I love when they use like strong language, vitulo media. We have nothing else to say on this topic. Meaning we've clearly proven that this is not a valid comparison. You can't resolve the contradiction with the woman by saying l'chatchila diavad, and therefore it can't serve as a proof for Ravina. And perhaps they're even saying this whole thing of Ravina, l'chatchila b'diavad, which again, as I said in the beginning, is hard logic to understand. If they're suspect, they're suspect. If they're not suspect, they're not suspect. What's this? Don't put them in that situation. Maybe they'll have to do something, but if they were already in it, we don't have to worry that something happened. Not the most convincing answer. Now we get to Rabbi Pedat. And from Rabbi Pedat, we're going to get off on some tangents that are going to take us into tomorrow's daf. Rabbi Pedat Amar, Lo Kashya, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbanan. Rabbi Pedat gives always the easiest answer when we have a contradictory source. This is two different people's opinions. Okay, you think one says, we're worried about Ravia. The other says, we're not worried about Ravia. That's because there's two different approaches. One thinks that idol worshippers are engaged in bestiality. We should be worried about it. And the other opinion thinks they don't. Okay, where's this machlok at Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis? Ditnan, as it says in the Mishna, and we're now going to talk about para aduma. Okay, nice that we just read this last week in shul. Fresh in your head. Ditnan gabe parat chatat. Okay, parat chatat is the para aduma. okay, because it's also called chatat. We're going to even see that later in the Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Eina nikachat mina goyim, v'chachamim mitirin. Okay, are you allowed to buy a para aduma from a non-Jew? Okay, again, non-Jew, do we mean idol worshiper? Okay, let's go with idol worshiper. So Rabbi Eliezer says you can't buy it from an idol worshiper. Now, if you're starting to think to yourself, wait a minute, we know a story where they bought a para aduma from a Gentile. Dama ben Natina, don't worry, we're going to get there tomorrow. Okay, that's Shabbos' daf. Dama ben Natina, the famous story. We're even going to start it today. But right now, let's put that out of our minds. So Rabbi Eliezer says you cannot purchase a para aduma from an idol worshiper. Comes the rabbis, chachamim mitirim, they say you can. My lava can be pagans. Is this not the root of their machloket? Rabbi Eliezer savar chashin on the rivia. Rabbanan savar lo chashin on the rivia. Right? Must be exactly this issue. A para aduma has to be, right? There's certain rules. It can't do work, right? And the assumption is it must be, it also can't have engaged in bestiality. So if you say you can buy it from a Gentile, or if you say you can't buy it from a Gentile, must be based on this exact machloket. Are we concerned that Gentiles, right, these idol worshippers, engage in bestiality with their animals, and therefore you can't purchase it from them? That's Rabbi Eliezer. And the rabbis say you can. So our Mishna that's worried about it is Rabbi Eliezer. And the braita that says you can buy animals for sacrifices from Gentiles is the rabbis. Just like you could buy sacrifices, you can also buy and the para aduma, no problem. But the Gemara is going to try to reject this in several manners. In the end, they will not be successful. But we're going to have 3 attempts to reject this answer of Rabbi Pedat. Mimai, who's to say that's the machloket? Okay, they're going to say maybe that's not the machloket, the rabbis and Rabbi Eliezer, about the para aduma. Maybe nobody's concerned that these idol worshippers engage in bestiality. So then why would Rabbi Eliezer forbid to buy the para aduma from a Gentile? Perhaps it has something to do with something else entirely. What does it have to do with? Something Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav. Now the topic here is going to be not because it engaged in bestiality, but because maybe it was worked. Now, the assumption here, the running assumption of this is somebody has a red heifer, even a non-Jew. They know that the Jews are going to pay a lot of money for a red heifer. So they're going to find out what they need to do with this red heifer to keep it in a state that it can be sold to the Jew. But Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav, so they know that you can't do work with it, okay? However, and therefore we can assume they won't do work with the animal. However, Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav, if you put on the animal, okay, what does it mean to work? Usually we mean work like plowing with the animal, something serious, carrying heavy loads. Even if you put on just a bunch of bags, empty bags, okay, that's one explanation of Udah Shel Sakin. There's a few different explanations what exactly it is. Whatever it is, it's something very light. If you put that on the animal, you can't use it as a para aduma anymore. Now that, it's possible the Gentiles will do that because it's not really work, right? So according to that, and okay, ube egla, now this is the egla rufa, something else. The egla rufa also can't be an animal that was worked, but we're not going to say it worked. Okay, for the egla rufa, we're going to be more lenient. If you put this udah shel sakin, but there achtim shochba, not just to put it on, you would have to pull the animal with carrying the udah shel sakin. Okay, so this is just a side point about the egla rufa, not relevant for our purposes. So now we're going to say, since Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav that if you put this udah shel sakin on the animal is disqualified to be para aduma, then perhaps that's the machlok of Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. Mar savar cheshinan, mar savar lo cheshinan. So Rabbi Eliezer says we should be concerned that maybe the Gentile used the animal to put on, one day they were standing there, they just had something and they stuck it on top of the animal and disqualified the animal. And the rabbis say, no, we don't have to worry about that they did such a thing. Okay, because again, I think it's an issue of you think they know the details of what Rav said and that you can't put this on, you can't put it on, or maybe they know, but they don't care. It's hard to know exactly why they would think this is an issue. In any case, we're going to reject this. The Gemara is going to say, lo sakadatach mishum nicha porta lo mafsid tuva. Say, no. For some small, okay, there's no way that anybody's concerned that they put on this udah shel sakin, which would mean we're going to reject. Can't be. Rabbi Eliezer holds that, which means that's not the machloka between him and the rabbis, because for a little bit of help, right? It's not such a big deal. You can just hold it in your hand, right? You're not gaining very much. For nicha porta, for a little bit of comfort, you're not going to mafsid tuva. You're not going to lose a ton of money. Again, you have a paraduma. That's like finding a big diamond in the middle of the street. That's a treasure. You're going to take extra care and find out everything there is about it, and no one's gonna put on this udashal sakin on the animal. No way, no how. So nobody could be concerned for that. So then they say, okay, well, if you say that, then what? If that's not the issue, then we're back to square one. What's the issue? Are you choshev for a via or not? Are you concerned that they engage in bestiality with the animal? So they say, hachanami lema mishum anah porta lo mafsid tuva, lo mafsid tuva. You could say the same thing for a little bit of pleasure, engaging in bestiality with this animal. What? They're going to lose all the money that they could get from a paraduma? Doesn't make sense either. So say, no, hatam yitzro tokfo. That's a different story. To put a load on an animal, there's not like some strong pull saying, I've got to put that on the animal. But to engage in bestiality, again, hard for us to understand. But obviously there was some strong sexual desire there. And the person just couldn't deal with their sexual desire and engage in bestiality, even though they knew, well, I'm going to lose the money, but they probably weren't thinking about it at that moment. Okay. And therefore you could say, no, we're not concerned for the udashal sakim, for that satchel of bags, but we are concerned for bestiality. Okay. And that's how we go back to the original assumption. But that was attempt one to say, no, this is not the distinction. But we didn't succeed. Attempt two to say the machloket is not, are we concerned for bestiality or are we not? Dilma kule ama lo cheshina lerevia. Just like we said, the first attempt to cancel, to reject it. Maybe also, nobody's really concerned for bestiality here. That's not the issue. So now we have to explain Rabbi Eliezer. Why did Rabbi Eliezer forbid purchasing animals from non-Jews for the paraduma? Simple reason, Kiditani Shila. Like Shila has a braita, which we're actually going to come back to and deal head on with at the end of the class today. Ditani Shila, my time at Rabbi Eliezer. What's his reason? It's what we call a gzerata katuv. It's learned out from a drasha on the pasuk. Daber al bnei Israel v'yakoelecha. Okay, this is what it says. It's in the first pasuk of Parshat Chukat. Zo chukat haTorah asher tzivah Hashem lemor. Okay, this is the chukah of the Torah. Daber al bnei Israel, statute of the law. Daber al bnei Israel v'yikchu elecha paraduma. Talk to the Jewish people and tell them to bring to you a paraduma. Now, v'yikchu generally means to purchase. Now, what they're going to learn is, right, the word to purchase could also be in Hebrew. You could switch the vowels to mean purchase from. Okay, vayakichu. Okay, so the way they're going to read it now is Bnei Israel yakichu ve'enu goyim yakichu. The Jews, it's not just the Jews are supposed to bring it, meaning purchase it. The Jews are supposed to buy it from Jews. In other words, the Jews are the ones who are supposed to sell it to other people. Ve'en goyim yakichu. The non-Jews are not allowed to sell to us, and we're not allowed to purchase from the Gentiles. And it's drashan, the word vayikchu. So it's a totally unique reason, has nothing to do with bestiality or not, according to this theory. It just has to do with the pasuk and what the pasuk says. To which the Gemara says, lo salkadata, can't be. Because the Katani Seif at the end of that braita says, where it talks about Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis and their machloket, that you can't buy paraduma from Gentiles, according to Rabbi Eliezer, and the rabbis say you can. It says, v'chein hayav Rabbi Eliezer posel b'chol korbanot kulam. According to this, Rabbi Eliezer also forbade buying any sacrifices from Gentiles, which, by the way, brings us back to where we started. We started with lokchim mehem be'emal korban. You can use them to purchase korbanot, which we now said, according to this answer of Rabbi Pedat, is the rabbi's opinion. And now we're going to see that Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with that as well. Now, if that's the case, then you can't say it's a special drasha vayikhu. It doesn't say vayikhu by sacrifices. If we went with Sheila's answer, Bishlam aparat, k'tiba kicha, we get by the paraduma, special drasha, because it says the language of kicha, acquiring, which again, we're going to mean selling. Ela kulu korbanot kicha ktiv behu. But other sacrifices, there's no kicha. This is a rhetorical question. It says ktiva, kicha by them? No, it doesn't. So we reject Sheila now, okay? Because it's not possible that if Rabbi Eliezer disagreed specifically because of Xerata Katuv in the Paraduma Sugya, that he wouldn't disagree about sacrifices, and he does. The fact that he disagrees about sacrifices further supports the reading that Rabbi Pedat brought, which is Rabbi Eliezer holds, right? The braita that says you can purchase them is the rabbis, and our Mishna, which says you're worried about bestiality, is Rabbi Eliezer, and that fits perfectly. Well, one more attempt to reject. Dilma akalo pligi Rabbanan later Rabbi Eliezer, turning out Amabet, Ela bepara de dameha yekarim. Aval b'shar korbanot module. Maybe the rabbis, maybe they don't disagree bestiality, not bestiality in general. They actually are generally, maybe the rabbis agree with Rabbi Eliezer, that in general we are concerned with bestiality, like our Mishna, okay? Just not by the paraduma because of what we mentioned earlier. Now, we mentioned earlier, specifically when it came to the Udash al-Saki, that when it comes to the paraduma, we're not worried about bestiality. Why not? Because dameh yikarim, because it's so expensive. And here we're not going to say yitzro tokfo and that, oh, he couldn't control himself. But no, we're going to say specifically that Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, maybe the rabbis, Lo pligate, they only disagree about the paraduma. Rabbi Eliezer says, paraduma, right, we're worried about bestiality. Because even though Damaya Karim Yitzro Tukfo, right, his temptation got the better of him. But the rabbis say, what are you talking about? No person in their right mind would do that and lose all the potential money for paraduma. They're going to get over their temptation for the sake, and maybe you could say there's a different temptation, which is money, right? There's money pulling. Those are the two big, right, pulls in life. Others as well, but those are two big ones. So the pull of the money is going to get the person to not engage in bestiality with that animal. So that's the machloka between them, specifically by the paraduma, because it's so expensive. Are you going to say, okay, therefore we're not concerned for bestiality, or maybe you're concerned anyway? But bishar korbanot, maybe the rabbis agree that in other for selling animals for sacrifices, maybe everyone would agree that you can't buy them because no one's going to say, oh, I'll lose all this money and therefore I won't engage in bestiality because it's not that much money. It's not a high ticket item. There's tons of animals out there. They can always buy an animal from someone else if you want to charge a high price. So that keeps the prices low, which means there's no incentive for the Gentile to get over their desires. Okay. And then you can't say that the source, now you see the problem right away, but you can't say the source, korban, is the rabbis, because maybe the rabbis agree with Rabbi Eliezer. This, by the way, is different than the other two attempts. The other two attempts said no one's concerned for Ravina. This is saying everyone's concerned for bestiality. It's just they have a machloket in paraduma because there maybe the rabbis think not because it's so expensive and they don't want to lose the potential money, the income they could get from it. But the main problem with this answer, and that probably explains why they were going in the other direction until now, well, then we have no Tana to attribute this opinion to. We assume everybody fits into Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. There's either the rabbis or Rabbi Eliezer who stands alone. Now, neither of them think that you can purchase an animal for a sacrifice according to the interpretation we just brought. And we have a clear source that says you can buy animals from Gentiles or from idol worshippers for sacrifices. So if the idol worshippers were concerned that they're engaging in bestiality, then nobody would allow this. And then we can't explain that braita. So it can't possibly be. And furthermore, if you think that the rabbis agreed in general with Rabbi Eliezer about no sacrifices, no acquiring them from pagans, well, Tanya Behedia, there's a braita that actually says that they explicitly say you can. We're going to see that right now. The braita reads like this: My Rabbi Eliezer. What did they respond to Rabbi Eliezer when he tried to say you can't buy animals? They quoted a pasuk that says clearly you can buy animals from the pagans, because what does it say? Kol tzon kedar yikavtzulach. Ya'alu. Now it's not exactly correct the way they have it in the. It says Ya'alu al ratzon mizbechi. Okay, so now Tzon Kedar is the tzon, the flocks of the Ishmaelites. Now, the Ishmaelites, it says, gather the tzon of the Ishmaelites to you, and they will go up on my altar. So what do you see here? There's clearly no prohibition, and that's what the rabbi said to Rabbi Eliezer, which means the rabbis clearly disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, not just about paraduma, also about sacrifices, which further now goes back to reinstate against the three difficulties that we have. We can now say wholeheartedly that Rabbi Pedat's answer, that there's Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, and it seems to be their disagreement is Choshishin Rivia, Lo Choshishin Rivia, and that's how we can resolve the contradiction. Our Mishnah follows Rabbi Eliezer that we are concerned, and therefore also, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you can't purchase paraduma from the pagans, and you also can't purchase sacrifices from the pagans. Versus the rabbis who think you can, not concerned for any of this, not concerned with you putting your animal alone in an inn, not concerned with buying animals for sacrifices, and not concerned with buying animals for paraduma. All of that is permitted, and there's two different approaches, and that's how we resolve the contradiction. So just to review, what we did so far was we had what we did so far in today's daf. This is really the end of this section, although we're going to get off on some tangents from it, which is how do we resolve the contradiction between the Mishna and the braita? One is to say the Gentiles' own animal versus someone else's animal. One is to say, lechatchila b'diavad, don't create a situation, but if it's already created, you don't have to worry that anything happened. And Rabbi Pedat, who said it's two different approaches, Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. We rejected Ravina's proof of his distinction, and we suggested three possibilities to reject Rabbi Pedat's answer, but in the end, we rejected all the rejections, and we're back to saying his answer is a good answer. Now, we're going to point out an inference that you could get to from here, and then see if that inference is really true. Well, the inference is definitely true. The question is where you can get from the inference. There's an inference from the inference. Okay, let's go like that. Now, if we go back to this machloket Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, we're going to deal now with Rabbi Pedat and a few things that he talked about. So the first one's going to be the whole question, according to him, the debate is choshishin l'rivia, lo choshishin l'rivia. So when it comes to the paraduma, the machloket is, do we have to be concerned? Can we purchase it from an idol worshiper or not? Do we have to be concerned and engage bestiality or not? That's only b'chashasha. Are we concerned? But aval hecha devadai riva. If it definitely engaged bestiality, let's say we have witnesses that saw this paraduma engaging in relations with its owner, okay, or with anyone. Psala, right? Obviously, pasla. Obviously, it's going to be disqualified. Okay, that's clear. Because the whole question is, choshishin or lo choshishin? Do we have to think that maybe this happened or maybe it didn't happen? But if it definitely happened, obviously you can't use this animal. That's inference number one. Reasonable inference. But inference number two from this is not necessarily going to be, we're going to end up rejecting it. But we're going to try to say this right now. Shema mina. De para kodshe mizbeachi. De kodshe berakabaye mi mifsala ba'revia. Now they're going to say this is a big deliberation about paraduma in general. Where do we categorize paraduma? Paraduma is, on the one hand, it's similar to a sacrifice, but it's very different from a sacrifice. Okay, because what happens? You deal with, first of all, the paraduma whole ceremony of taking the animal, burning it, then taking its ashes. All that happens on Har Zeitim, on the Mount of Olives. It doesn't happen on the Temple Mount. It doesn't happen in the temple. Okay, it happens outside the temple. So that already makes us sound like it's not really what they're going to call here kodshe mizbeach, things that go on the altar. It also doesn't get brought on the altar at all. Okay, now things that go on the altar have a certain level of sanctity. In general, we say, okay, there's a lot of differences between that and bedek habayit. We've talked about this many times. Bedek habayit is you're bringing the value of something to the temple. You're going to use it for maintenance, upkeep of the temple. And then there's money that goes to the altar, like an animal that you designate. We've learned that has kedushat haguf. That in and of itself, you can't redeem it. There's all sorts of rules about it. Things that are kedushat damim or kedushat bedek habayit only have kedushat damim, which means their value is. But you can redeem the value onto a coin and change the sanctity. So there's all sorts of differences between kodshe mizbeach and kodshe bedek habayit. The big question is paraduma is where do we put it? Because it's not exactly like for maintenance of the temple. It's got itself its own right. It's a ceremony you do with it. On the other hand, it's not done in the temple. So where does it fall? So now they say, if you can't use an animal to engage in bestiality, this must be that it's like kodshe mizbeach, has the same sanctity as things that go on the altar. That's their attempt right now. So the Gemara says, no. And what they're trying to say is like this. The reason why bestiality will disqualify the animal is because it's kosher mizbeach. And once it's kosher mizbeach, right, it goes into that category and all the rules apply. And then it's part of a bigger thing. It's not just okay, engaged bestiality, it's a problem because of something. No, it's because it's in the fact that disqualifies it must mean that it's part of this category of kosher mizbeach. And that's what they're going to reject. They're going to say no. They're going to try two different attempts. The first one will reject in the end, but the second one will be accepted, which is it's a different reason. It's not because it's kosher mizbeach. It's for something else. And this doesn't prove that it's kosher mizbeach. It could be kosher bedekabayit. The level of sanctity could be that, and yet still you can't use an animal engaged in bestiality for some other reason. So the first reason given is shani para de chatat kar yerachmana. I told you we get back to this. They called it para chatat before because the pasuk says chatat he. Okay, it talks about the para and the heifer para aduma, and he calls it chatat. Chatat is usually a word used for a sin offering, for a sacrifice. So it's not because it has the sanctity of sacrifices, it's because it's called chatat. So the Torah is telling you it has certain characteristics like a chatat, which would be no bestiality, right? The animal couldn't have engaged in bestiality before. And that's what they're trying to say. Now, there's a problem with this, though, because well, if that's the case, then you shouldn't be able to use a para aduma, a red heifer, that was born from a C-section. Now, why? Well, if you're going to say it's like a sacrifice, and it has rules of sacrifices, okay, even if it doesn't have a sanctity of a sacrifice, it doesn't fall into that, but we'd have rules like a sacrifice. And one of the rules of a sacrifice is, it says by an animal, it says, ki tivaled, okay, and then it has to be 7 days under its mother, and then on the 8th day, you can use it as a sacrifice. So in the pasuk about sacrifices, it says ki valed. Ki valed means when it's born, right? After it's born, you have to wait 7 days, and on the 8th day, you can use it for a sacrifice. They learn from there that a sacrifice can only be from an animal that goes through a natural birth and not a C-section. So you can't bring an animal for a sacrifice if it went through a C-section, if it was born in that way. So if we're going to say this is chatat, then you're going to say the same thing holds true for the paraduma. Now, maybe you say, maybe it is pasul b'yotzei dofen. Why are you saying it isn't? Maybe a paraduma that's born in this way, just like a sacrifice, is disqualified. Well, alama tanya, why does it say in a braita, hikdisha b'yotzei dofen psula, Rabbi Shimon machshir? He sanctified a paraduma that was a yotzei dofen. So the rabbis say it's disqualified, but Rabbi Shimon says it's fine. So there's no way to explain Rabbi Shimon if you go with this chatat. How could Rabbi Shimon possibly allow it? Now, they want to make one suggestion that maybe could answer Rabbi Shimon. Very interesting one. Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Shimon actually, in a different sugya, in Nida, we'll get to Bezrat Hashem a little under 2 years, he talks about not birth of animals. He talks for sacrifices, but he talks about women giving birth to children. And he says, okay, there's all these rules in the Torah, how many days of impurity, how many days of purity, right? There's dam toar, dam tame. Okay, we're going to get to all this stuff later. And then you have to bring a sacrifice. Okay, it depends on male, female, how many days, all that. So you have to wait for X number of days of impure blood, then there's X number of days of pure blood. Only after that can you bring your sacrifice, but then you're obligated to sacrifice. This all, according to Tanakama, is only if she has a regular birth. If the woman gives birth by C-section, it's not. Rabbi Shimon says, no, a C-section is a regular birth. Okay, this is right, it's a fascinating topic. He says a C-section is a regular birth. It's called regular birth. All the rules of dam, all the damim, the bloods, the sacrifice, it's all valid for a yotzei dofen, for a C-section birth. Now, so now they want to say, well, maybe that's why Rabbi Shimon, he just has a whole different approach to C-sections. So we'll say the same thing by a sacrifice, but you can't say that because Rabbi Yochanan said about Rabbi Shimon, we're going to assume Rabbi Yochanan was telling, knew, Modeh ya Rabbi Shimon linyan kodeshim she'eno kadosh. He agrees when it comes to sacrifices that we don't say the same thing about a C-section. In other words, his whole thing about a C-section being like a regular birth only has to do with the machloket he discussed about women, not about animals giving birth. And therefore, it doesn't make any sense to say that the para aduma, you can't use an animal engaged in bestiality only because of chatat, because if it's chatat, then you would disqualify a C-section as well. And Rabbi Shimon actually permits it, and we have no way to explain Rabbi Shimon according to this. So we're back to square one, which is what they're saying. It must be the paraduma is kosher mizbeach. And that's why, right, it has the sanctity of the altar, of things brought on the altar, and therefore you can't use an animal to engage in bestiality. But now the Gemara is going to say, no. The reason you can't do that has to do with something else. Elashani para, and this one we'll be successful at, and we won't be able to prove that the para is kosher mizbeach. Ho'il umum posel ba, because a mum disqualifies it. You can't bring a blemished one, and that it says clearly in the psukim about the para aduma. You can't bring a para aduma that's blemished. Dvar ervava, but that's nami posel ba. So we're gonna say mum goes together with, and we'll prove that in a minute. Whatever an animal that's blemished. Also, you can't bring an animal that was used for idol worship and engaged in erva and sexual relations. So, right, in bestiality. Dichtiv. How do we know this? So basically, we're going to say once you have mum equals, okay, whatever mum disqualifies, also erva, also Avodah Zarah disqualifies. Dichtiv. Ki moshchetam bam, bahem mum bam. Okay, this is a pasuk in Vayikra Kaf Bet. Okay, it's not in the context of paraduma. It doesn't need to be. It's saying the word mum goes together with mashchatam. Mashchatam comes from hashchata, destruction. Vitana debe Rabbi Ishmael. The braita, the house of Rabbi Ishmael said, kol makom. Now, first we have to define. We're going to say basically mum and hashchata. There's a hekesh. What's true for one, right? They're going to go together. What is hashchata? We're now going to prove it's erva and avodah zarah. Now we have to prove from other psukim. But he says, eno eladvar. So, kol makom shneimar hashchata, eno eladvar erva avodah zarah. The word hashchata, destruction, refers to avodah zarah and arayim. Now, dvar erva dichtiv ki yishchit et basar kol basar et kol haaretz. This is the generation of the flood. So, what did they do? They destroyed the word hishchit and darko haaretz. Darko, generally we talk about derech, is often a euphemism or a word for sexual relations, and they were engaged in inappropriate sexual relations. Since Sefer Dvarim, right? Moshe is warning to them, lest you become destroyed and you make yourself, right? You destroy yourselves kind of thing and make yourself an idol. So hashchata goes with idol worship. Hashchata goes with inappropriate sexual relations. From there we get to mum and hashchata were in the same pasuk. So from there we get to, right, what a mum, since a mum is disqualified, that's what we're going to say here. So it's not just a blemish. These are both also blemishes, just a different kind of blemish. One is a physical blemish, and one is more a spiritual blemish that you've engaged in things you shouldn't be engaged in, right? They're not noticeable blemishes, but they're there. Okay, so that explains why the paraduma can't be an animal that's engaged in bestiality because of the mum. The mum disqualification includes that as well and has nothing to do with kosher mizbeach. So this section was an inference from there. Again, we made two inferences. One is it was just choshishin or not choshishin, but if you knew for sure, of course, everyone would agree it's disqualified. And then we get from there, well, it must be kosher mizbeach then. But they say it's not kosher mizbeach because it could be because of the mum. Now we're going to go into the skufa, and from here we'll start Dama Ben Natina today, but just a teeny weeny bit, and then we'll get to, right, we're not going to even get to the one yet about the paraduma, that's going to come later. Gufa, Tani Shila, my Tamid Rabbi Eliezer, Tichtiv, the Rabbi Israel, Yikhu, Bnei Israel Yakichu, the Ein Goyim Yakichu. Okay, again, that means when it says Vayikhu, it doesn't mean just buy, it means also sell. So it means it has to be sold from a Jew, not sold from a idol worshiper. Elame'ata, they say, wait a minute, if you're going to make that drasha, Sheila, then we're going to question you from another place where it says yikhu. And we know that people purchase these from Gentiles. Daber b'nei Israel v'yikhuli truma. This is for the Mishkan, for the tabernacle. Okay, it says, bring me truma. Now, if you're going to, and it says b'nei Israel. So hachanami b'nei Israel yakichu, b'nei goyim yakichu. Does that mean you have to bring items to the tabernacle only if they were sold to you from Jews and not from Gentiles? Well, if you want to say that's true, and here comes our story. Rabbi Yehuda says the name Shmuel. I don't know if you knew this, but Shmuel is the one who passes on this story. Rabbi Yehuda passes the name Shmuel. Shalu et Rabbi Eliezer at Hechan kibud avayim. They asked Rabbi Eliezer, to what extent you have to do kibud avayim? Respect your parents. From here we get to the famous Dama Ben Natina story. If you don't know it, you'll learn it tomorrow, or maybe today. It'll go up soon. Amar lahem tzuru masa goy echal aviv ba'ashkelon. Look at the person. Look at this Gentile who did this for his father in Ashkelon. But Dama ben Netina Shmo, his name is Dama ben Netina. Pamachat, I'll just end with the sentence, we'll finish the daf. Bikshu mimenu avanim le'ephod. They wanted to buy from him stones for the ephod, which is used in the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And what do you see, or in the temple? What do you see? That here they bought things for the temple from a Gentile. So obviously, vayiklu doesn't mean, right, when Bnei Israel and vayiklu go together, it doesn't necessarily mean, and that's again against Sheila, that it has to be purchased from a Jew. Okay, so what we did today, again, we summarized right at the beginning, 3 answers to the contradiction. Through the last answer, we got into some other issues. So from there, we got to this paraduma, is it kosher mizbeach, which we then proved it wasn't. And the second attempt to try to reject Rabbi Pedat was this Tana Shila about the reason for Rabbi Eliezer, which the Gemara already rejected before. Now we're going to reject for a different reason and basically say can't possibly be because of ramifications of that in some other place where Vayikul comes up with Bnei Israel, and we see it's not true from the story of Dama ben Netina, and we will get to the issue of obviously also the paraduma being purchased from Dama ben Netina as well. And from there, we're going to learn, interestingly, we're in Masechet Avodah Zarah, and we've been having all these issues about, Gentiles, or we're concerned about this, we're concerned about that, these idol worshippers, and then all of a sudden we start praising this Dama ben Netina, who's obviously considered in high regard, that we should learn halacha from him about how to do kibbutz aim, which again raises all the complexity of these situations, and it's not obviously black and white, which we've discussed many times. Nice to see the Gemara is addressing it as well. From here, we'll finish for today, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.